The radar repeater bloomed with 5 fast-moving surface tracks. They were punching north through the Strait of Hormuz, small signatures moving at speeds that defied the calm morning sea. Inside the Combat Information Center, the air grew cold as a watchstander leaned into his console. 5 contacts, closing hard, bearing steady, range dropping. This wasn't a drill, and it wasn't a mistake. On the flight deck, the smell of jet fuel still hung heavy, but the rhythm of the day had just been shattered by a sharp, unmistakable pulse. Something was coming straight for the carrier, and the ocean was about to turn into a kill zone. On the bridge, the silence was replaced by the mechanical precision of a warship waking up. Binoculars were glued to the starboard side as the horizon turned into a flat line of steel. The carrier didn't alter its course because a ship this size does nothing without a calculated reason. Instead, the first response was a cold, clinical confirmation of the threat. In the CIC, the tracks updated again with terrifying speed. Course committed, closest point of approach shrinking by the second. A second voice cut through the room, clipped and calm, recommending classification. Nobody said the word attack yet, but everyone felt it vibrating through the deck. In waters this tight, assumptions are the fastest way to get people killed. Fishing boats drift and civilian traffic wanders through these corridors every single day, but civilian hulls don't move with this kind of predatory intent. These 5 ships were locked in a pattern aimed directly at the outer edge of a US carrier formation. This wasn't just a ship they were targeting, it was a floating airfield wrapped in steel and escorted by the most sophisticated warships ever built. The screen was already reacting, with a destroyer on the outer ring edging across the water to put itself between the fast movers and the carrier's exposed flank. Below the deck, the tactical picture was sharpening into a nightmare scenario. Long-range optical systems punched through the early morning haze while infrared overlays snapped into place. One by one, the contacts took form: narrow hulls, high bows, and fast attack profiles. Heavy spray kicked off their sides as they slammed through the chop. Then came the confirmation that changed everything. These were Iranian-type fast boats. The Strait of Hormuz is narrow enough to compress bad decisions into seconds, and there is no luxury of distance here. One aggressive move could turn this tense intercept into a live engagement. The captain studied the horizon through magnified glass before giving the order to track them and log everything. He demanded no assumptions, not because the danger was small, but because it was very real. Out on the water, the boats were now visible to the naked eye. They looked small against the massive carrier, almost insignificant at first glance. But small craft are deceptive in confined waters because they turn faster and move quicker than anything else. If they were armed, they could force a warship into a split-second rules of engagement problem that no captain wants to solve when it is already too late. The lead boat shifted left, while 2 others began spacing wide to open their pattern. The last pair stayed back just enough to suggest military discipline rather than a random mob. Inside the CIC, an operator zoomed in on the lead craft and froze the frame. Exposed crew, forward mounts, and possible heavy weapons were all visible, yet no one overreacted. That is the fundamental difference between a trained warship and a frightened one. The carrier held its steady course while weapons crews across the entire formation quietly manned their stations. Safety covers came off and tracking systems began to align. Somewhere on an escort ship, a CIWS mount rotated a few degrees and stopped. It was a subtle movement intended to be seen but not to escalate. This is the language of naval power in a place like this: precision, posture, and total control. By 5:16, the range closed again. The boats weren't just approaching anymore, they were testing the formation. Their wakes stretched long and white behind them, clear even in the slant light of dawn. They were riding hard with engines pushing at full commitment. There was no drift or confusion. This was an intentional charge, and the lead contact was now on a direct intercept geometry. On the flight deck, sailors turned to stare over the edge as the speed of the approaching boats became obvious. They looked wrong against the calm of the sea, like rounds fired low across a sheet of glass. The captain remained silent for a moment before ordering the standby warnings. The carrier still didn't blink, but all around it, the steel was waking up. 5 Iranian fast boats were charging straight at a multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier, and the first warning was finally sent out. It was flat and professional, informing them they were approaching a US naval formation at an unsafe speed and bearing. The message rolled across open maritime frequencies and disappeared into the silence of the morning. There was no reply. Inside the carrier's combat information center, nobody looked surprised. The 5 boats were still coming, their tracks firm on the screen with no hesitation. What had started as a possible surface anomaly was now a coordinated run. A second warning was transmitted, shorter and sharper than the first. Still there was nothing, no static, no broken signal, and no confusion. That silence was a decision. In the Strait of Hormuz, radio silence from an approaching military craft is an act of aggression. The captain kept his eyes forward, refusing to dramatize the moment or bark orders. He watched the geometry of the encounter unfold mechanically: speed, bearing, intent, space, and time. One of the escorts pushed farther out, tightening the angle between itself and the approaching swarm. From above, the movement would look almost invisible, but on the tactical plot, it was a precise defensive maneuver. 5 small boats against a carrier strike group seems uneven on paper, but in a narrow corridor, they can force irreversible decisions. The game was now about who would flinch first in this compressed space. The camera feed sharpened as the lead Iranian boat surged, its hull slamming down hard between the crests of the waves. A surface warfare officer studied the feed and confirmed what everyone already suspected. This was a coordinated swarm profile. Above them, the flight deck began to change as crew cleared lanes and tow tractors pulled back. An MH-60 Seahawk was pushed toward launch readiness with its rotor blades unlocked. Ground crews moved with the speed that comes from years of repetition. The carrier was preparing its options, and the tension was reaching a breaking point as the range ticked down. Warnings were transmitted for a third time, now using standard maritime command cadence. The message was unmistakable: alter course and stay clear. Still, the boats pressed in. The destroyer screening the carrier's flank increased its speed, with white water boiling behind its stern as it positioned itself as a shield of steel. Inside the escort's mount positions, gun crews were fully manned and feed systems were verified. Optical trackers held steady on the approaching hulls. Nothing had fired yet, and nothing was close to firing. But the line was getting thinner with every second that passed without a response. Electronic warfare teams began picking up low-level emissions from the Iranian craft. It wasn't a weapons lock yet, but it was surface search behavior mixed with active sweeps. They were painting the formation, measuring the carrier group even as they ran toward it. The captain received the update and nodded once, ordering his team to document everything but hold the formation. That order said everything. He refused to flinch or give the Iranians the panicked reaction they were looking for. By 5:19, the boats were close enough that sailors could see the silhouettes and helmets of the men on board. The sea between the two sides was collapsing fast. What looked like abstract threats on a radar screen minutes ago now felt immediate and physical. One of the boats made a sudden move, snapping inward to tighten its path toward the outer screen. In the CIC, the watch team saw it instantly and confirmed the direct intercept geometry. No one had to raise their voice because the warnings had been sent and the radios worked. The Iranians knew exactly what they were doing. They were still charging, and the next few seconds would determine if this encounter ended in a retreat or a tragedy. At 5:20, the Seahawk lifted off the deck in a blast of rotor wash. It dipped its nose forward the moment its wheels left the non-skid, skimming low over the water toward the incoming threat. Below, the carrier kept its course with thousands of tons of steel moving exactly where they intended to go. This steadiness was the ultimate message. The US Navy wasn't repositioning out of fear. It was holding its ground out of total control. From the cockpit, the pilot reported that the 5 fast craft were still converging. What looked tense from the carrier deck looked even worse from the air. The helicopter dropped lower, its rotor wash tearing at the water around the lead craft. The crew chief leaned into his harness, looking down through the open side while the sensor operator locked the camera onto the target. Every frame was recorded and time-stamped. Back on the destroyer, the Mark 45 5-inch gun was trained but not elevated. The white dome of the CIWA sat in quiet readiness, seconds away from violence if the choice was made for them. The lead Iranian boat was now entering the weapons quality envelope, a phrase that chilled the room more than any alarm ever could. The lead boat punched through the destroyer's outer wake, its bow launching into the air as it twisted through the spray. For a violent second, it looked unstable and almost airborne before slamming back down. Another Iranian craft tried to drift wider, looking for a cleaner lane around the screen, but the Seahawk answered immediately. The helicopter banked hard and dropped lower, forcing its presence into that gap. It didn't threaten with weapons. It threatened with the unmistakable fact that every move was being tracked. The Iranian formation began to stretch and fracture under the pressure. The rear pair of boats were no longer aligned, and their timing was slipping. One was charging while another seemed to hesitate over the rough water. The shape of the attack was coming apart, not because of missiles, but because the US Navy was turning the sea itself into a weapon. The destroyer dragged a heavy wall of weight across the approach lane, forcing the small boats into bad water at impossible angles. Small craft live on speed and agility, and when you take away their smooth water, that speed turns into instability. The trap was made of physics, and it was closing fast. By 5:22, the lead boat crossed into the narrowest part of the approach. One more committed move would have forced a lethal answer. Inside the CIC, every tracker was locked, and on the destroyer, every weapon was ready. But then, the first crack appeared in the Iranian charge. The lead boat was still hammering forward, but the four behind it were no longer moving as one. Their rhythm was off, and they were fighting the water instead of the geometry. The destroyer's wake was acting as a physical barrier, and the Iranians were realizing they didn't have a clear path to their target. The Seahawk pilot rolled the aircraft into a hard bank, sliding down to dominate the space where the Iranians were looking for an escape angle. From the boat below, the gray naval helicopter must have looked enormous. The boat checked its speed, a subtle reduction that meant everything in a close quarters encounter. Inside the CIC, the update came fast. The starboard flankers were slowing and the aft pair were separating. The swarm was dead. It was now just 5 individual boats dealing with the reality of American control. The carrier hadn't moved an inch from its original path. The lead Iranian boat slammed through the wake one last time and came down crooked, its nose yawing offline. The driver corrected, but the mistake cost him his momentum. Behind him, the others began to angle off. The report the captain had been waiting for finally came through. Lead contact dropping speed. A beat later, the port side element turned away. This was the first real admission that the pressure had reversed. Iran had come forward to force a reaction, but the US Navy had taken the sea away from them without firing a single shot. The charge was officially broken. The boats began a gradual, unmistakable bend away from the destroyer's wake and toward open water. The Seahawk stayed with them, its sensor turret tracking hull numbers and weapons mounts until they were clear. The water was saying what the Iranians wouldn't. The run was over. The destroyer eased its maneuver, but the gun crew stayed manned and the CIWE stayed ready. No one powered down early because 5 boats had just driven right up to the edge of a lethal response. The only reason the day didn't end in fire was because the Americans owned every inch of the encounter. By 5:27, the Iranian craft were outside the danger zone, still tracked but no longer dictating the terms. On the flight deck, the rhythm of the day returned, though the tension remained in the sailors' bodies. Iran had come for a headline and a moment of defiance, but they found a force that didn't panic or surrender a single inch of water. 5 boats charged a carrier and thought they were in control, but they were met with something colder than firepower. They were met with absolute authority. In the Strait of Hormuz, control is what decides who keeps coming and who turns away first.